And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again. And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again. And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over 1,000 times again. And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over 1,000 times again. And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over 1,000 times again. And together,
although I know we'd all like to be together in person, we are excited to host the Virtual Training Institutes and really want to encourage you to continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month through August. Each month, you'll have a choice of 2 back-to-back workshops, so mark your calendars. Choose your workshops and make sure you reserve your place early so that you can attend the workshop that most interests you. Today, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions. Post your comments and share your resources with your colleagues. Our presenters, they definitely want to hear from you. And it is absolutely your participation that will make each of these sessions a success. As a reminder, staff are monitoring the chat and they're going to make sure the facilitators see your questions and comments, so be sure and engage. A few other reminders to include: if you need assistance at any time navigating through these virtual spaces or accessing links to workshops, we do have a live help desk support standing by to assist. We are also providing a certificate of attendance after the completion of each workshop, and all of our workshops are being recorded, so by you participating, you're implying consent. Finally, there will be an ASL interpreter or closed captioning available during each workshop. Those interpreters can be pinned when available for those who require interpretation by hovering over the interpreter's video and selecting the 3 dots. One of the options that will appear is pin video. By selecting the pin video, this video will not move out of view. With our theme, What Could Be? Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures for Children, Youth, Young Adults, and Their Families, all of our sessions will challenge us to envision a future where the voices of children, youth, young adults, and their families are elevated, especially those who are most frequently silenced or marginalized, where we use the best data and research available to challenge ourselves, developing new ideas and approaches that can be implemented to meet the needs of youth and families, and in service of our commitment to social justice and the elimination of disproportionality and disparities. My hope is that today's session will provide you with food for thought as you consider your next steps in creating a vibrant, equitable future for youth with complex needs and their families. Please don't forget to register for next month's workshop. Remember, they're held the first Thursday of every month, and you can visit the institute.umaryland.edu for the full schedule.
Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you for spending part of your day with us, thinking and learning together. And I'm Gwen White. I'm from NTAC, and I'm joined today by Johanna Bergan and Maryann Davis. We want to talk with the fact that I think you have all experienced in your work or your lives that typical services do not result in good outcomes for young adults. In fact, they result in poor outcomes for young adults. And we would like to hear some of your opinions on what can be barriers and how to correct these poor outcomes. So please take a moment to take our poll on the statement policies can be a hindrance or an addition to policies can be a barrier to meeting the needs of youth, young adults, and families during transition. What are your thoughts on that? Oh, 84 responses. Thank you. Okay. I think we can stop sharing that now. Thank you for your answers. And yes, we are pleased that you had so many true answers, that policies can either restrict or they can free good transition practices. So a recap. This is the basis for which we're going to be talking today. Young adults of transition age have poor outcomes, but all of us believe very firmly that there's the possibility of better outcomes. And those policies can impact those better outcomes through decreasing the policies that interfere with good practices and increasing the policies that support or enhance practices. Maryann and Johanna are going to discuss some of the principles that are critical to effective policy change. These have been developed over the last 15 years through research, lessons learned from very specific SAMHSA grant funding, and the experiences of young adults, youth, and their families. Maryann.
Thank you, Gwen. So we started really thinking about what policies were needed to support good services specifically for young people during adolescence and during young adulthood, so that they could have good services that were developmentally appropriate and appealing to them throughout that period of time when they're moving from adolescence into adulthood. So at the time that we came up with the basic policy tenets back in 2005, we were using the research from the previous 10 years to try to shape what we thought were critical elements that needed to be in policy to allow for that kind of a service system. So we didn't feel like we needed to reiterate what are good policies in general for any population. So what we're going to offer today, we're going to start with those primary 5 tenets that we developed back in 2005 that are specific to youth and young adults as they transition from adolescence into young adulthood. And we'll be adding to those 2 more tenets that have become very apparent since that ancient time back in 2005. So Gwen, if you want to quickly put up the 5, because I will go over each one at a time. But these are, my apologies. If we were all live together, I would have had a little bottle of water with me, but I have my little teacup. So the central policy tenets, basically, I'm just going to read through these quickly so you can have them in your mind about what we think are central, and then we'll go through sort of the rationale for each one. So we need a provision of continuity of care from the earliest stages of transition at ages 14 or 16, well into young adulthood at either 25 or age 30, depending on how you conceptualize that. We need to support the role of family up until ages 25 or 30, essentially through this transition period. We need the provision of continuity of care across the many systems that offer relevant services. We need to promote the existence of a density, a certain number available of developmentally appropriate services from which those individualized service and treatment plans can be constructed. You have to have enough of those available to make them well tailored to an individual's needs. And we need to have policies that support the expertise of individuals working with individuals in this age group. So let's go to the next slide and talk about central policy tenet number 1. So the provision of continuity of care from ages 14 or 16 to ages of 25 or 30 really comes from the recognition that we have organized our public systems that pay for various services, generally into those in the child system and those in the adult system. Each of them tends to have an age-based eligibility criteria, and that those age-based criteria typically produce an arbitrary barrier. Nothing has really changed about the individual. Their needs often remain very much the same, but they've hit a birthday. And that birthday has suddenly made the eligibility criteria something different, a different criteria that they have to meet. We also have federal and state policies that start or end with an age group within the 14 to 30 year age range. So, for example, federal or state programs that are labeled as youth programs often will end at age 18 or at age 21. And when it ends, there usually is not a counterpart on the adult side. I'm also realizing that I'm gesturing away and none of you can see this. I will try to either raise them or do without them. But basically, the policy tenet that we address first is this trying to help an individual cross from the child system, which is comprised of these many different systems on the left. And when you hit age 18 to 21, you must move from whatever child system that you've been served in, if you've been receiving services, into, if there is, an adult counterpart to that service. And one of the interesting things that has happened since 2005, when this initially occurred, is that several of these sort of dotted green arrows, really in recognition of the needs of young people extending, it doesn't end at age 18, supports that are developmentally appropriate and help young person move into adulthood, now often do extend actually up to age 25. So federal legislation around child welfare makes that more available for many young adults in up to age 25. And that's been a development since that time. So you can see that then on the adult side of the system, there are a whole host of services on that side as well. And so policies that can help an individual have continuity of care crossing from being in a children's system into the adult system are essential to us being able to have the flexibility to provide good services. Next slide, please. Policy tenet number 2, supporting the family role up to ages 25 or 30. So I think probably everybody who's present here today realizes that there are a lot of challenges to family involvement in their child's care, particularly as a young person reaches age 18. And sometimes at age 16, that the legal rights of young adults uniformly start at age 18, that allows a young adult to preclude the involvement of their parents or guardians or anybody else in their care to help them. It is up to their discretion. And that's not that is a bad thing per se, but what we don't have are policies that actually encourage providers and young people to consider the positive role that their family members, even if it's their family of choice, might be to them as they move into services as a young adult. And it's very hard to write into policy the complexity of that relationship. Often it can take many different forms. A young person may really say, from a very legitimate point of view, I don't want family involvement at this point. And that may actually be in their best interest, when at other times they would get a lot of support that would be very helpful to them in their future. And that complexity is hard to write into policy, but it is worth considering, how do we achieve that in a way that allows for a highly individualized approach that allows for the encouragement of family involvement and family of choice involvement as a young person enters young adulthood. Next slide, please. So tenet number 3 is the provision of continuity of care across the many systems. So we know that the challenges to continuity of care, this is not just simply from the child system to the adult system. This is now looking at each of those individual services that we saw on that chart and saying, we need continuity of care and coordination of care across those many. If you picture maybe a spiral kind of going through that entire system, that we have fragmented children's systems and fragmented adult systems. And during the transition age, young people and the people who care about them and try to provide services for them encounter about every fragmentation and barrier and wall and eligibility criteria possible. So we need services that can be negotiated across the multiple eligibility criteria. It requires that many systems be at the table, forging policies together. I think a lot of people who are attending are probably familiar with a lot of the efforts that were done in systems of care for children. And those all required many players at the table to construct policies that would be beneficial, including family members and youth, but also many systems. Now the adult system also, and those various systems within that need to be brought to the table as well. It requires alignment now of more funding streams to allow for continuity and that depth of knowledge of not just within the child system and not just within the adult system, but now across both of those systems. So these are policies that would essentially allow this picture to look like an actual coordinated set of services that any young person could access. Next slide, please. Gwen, can you do the next slide, please? Oh, it's not moving. There we go. So the second to last tenet of the basics is to promote a density of developmentally appropriate services from which individualized service and treatment plans can be produced or constructed. So the issue here is that in many, although this has improved tremendously since 2005, it is still the case that we don't have policies that really mandate that services pay attention to the unique needs and preferences of the transition age population. And so looking for an appealing and developmentally appropriate service can be extremely difficult if primarily there are services, say, for younger adolescents, or the services are really designed for people 30, 50 years old. And you add to that when there's an insufficient funding of services, that systems tend to provide only the basics. And so they don't have specialized programs, or they focus down much more narrowly on their target population. And this age group tends to fall in between the focus of child and adolescent systems and the focus of adult systems that sit more clearly within their main age group. And so those kinds of events make it hard to really result in enough services that are developmentally appropriate and appealing for transition age young people. Next slide. And our final original classic policy tenet was to have policies that actually support there being expertise in this age group and in this disability group. There are a lot of challenges to having that expertise. This has also grown tremendously, but it's still the case that policies often don't require people to have expertise in this population. Policies also don't encourage the training of expertise during professional training or once one is out on the job. And we often don't have policies that require or support the supervision of people who are providing the services that will allow them that guidance to ensure that they remain in their practice in a way that is developmentally appropriate and appealing. So these are the 5 original classic policy tenets that we had put forth to try to help us think about policies that are needed to be changed or built to allow for a better system of care for young people as they move from adolescence into young adulthood. Johanna, do you want to talk about the newest additions?
Yes, thank you, Maryann. So as Maryann indicated while she began her talk, these policy tenets were established in 2005. A couple of things have happened while that time has passed. I think there have been repeated conversations about, should we go back and do this research process again? Might these policy tenets be different? And what the practice in the field is showing us through initiatives like system of care grantees who focus on this older young adult population, or the Healthy Transition Initiative, what practice is showing us is actually these key policy tenets remain true and needed in the field today. And what this practice has shown us is that there are a couple of other key areas that we've sort of agreed on a practice level need to be focused on. So the first is really advancing an anti-racist system, which is equitable and responsive to diverse young adult populations. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. And the second is really to support the implementation of peer-delivered services. So let's talk about what those look like. Gwen, thank you. Awesome. So the sixth policy tenet that we're proposing to you all today is really to address the fact that the population of young adults between 16 and 25 years of age is not a homogeneous population. It's quite a diverse population, and we need to create a system and really, Maryann, as you spoke about that density of developmentally appropriate services, what was coming up for me is we need a density of services that are responsive to the cultural needs and the definition of mental wellness for our diverse young adults. Several challenges and work that we need to do in this area that first connected to the availability of services that are designed to meet and are provided by a provider system that understands the uniqueness of the definition of mental health, the approach to care of young people of color, of young people who identify as LGBTQ youth, of young immigrant populations. The second is that there is documentation of incredible disparity among young people in their ability to equally access services. So even if they're ready to say, I have a mental health need, I would benefit from support and service, the ability to even walk into a provider is so different, much less the ability to walk into a place of service and see someone that looks like you reflected back at you, who understands your culture. And then there's just this trueness that we are seeing that both consciously and subconsciously our system, our mental health system, has racist tendencies within it. Some of these are documented practices where we might want to actually dismantle policy, an interesting thing for us to think about in this workshop. And the second is sort of this unconscious, long-held practice. We know that these practices are racist in nature because of the outcomes we're seeing, that young men of color are being provided antipsychotic medications or multiple medications at a much higher rate than their peers, or the fact that young people who will, outside of the service system, acknowledge that they are part of the LGBTQ youth population, but unable or unwilling because of stigma or concern within the system to disclose this. Because we know this is a reality, we also know there's work we need to dig into to uncover and reverse some of these practices. The next policy, thank you, Gwen. The next policy that we're adding here, so sort of the seventh policy tenet we propose, is this concept of implementing peer-delivered services. So the peer movement and the concept of services being delivered by peers has a long history in our country. The work of young people to provide youth-to-youth peer support is relatively new. Only as recently as 2013 was there a clear pathway forward to provide Medicaid funding for youth peer-delivered services within the mental health service. What we know is that young people, by nature, are most likely to reach out to their peers, to their friend group, to folks that are like them for help and concern, particularly for help around mental health challenges. And so we want to challenge the system to think about how do we make policy decisions to provide funding to support the implementation of effective workforce and of really creating a mental health system that allows and integrates youth peer services within it. This is a shift from some of our traditional ways of providing services, and yet a shift that young people are very clearly asking for. So these are sort of the new fold, the welcome to 2021 work that we want to welcome you into. What we hope is happening right now is that things are coming up for you when you think about these policy tenets. So I'm going to invite you all to actually share what is coming up to you, what is feeling most important to you about these policy tenets. And we're going to ask you to use a technology to do that. Instructions are coming in the chat box, but we would love for you to grab a second screen. That might be your cell phone that's handy or another internet browser on your computer. And we're going to ask you to go to the website menti.com, menti.com. And when you go to that website, it's just a white screen with a little blank box in the middle. The code for our super secret poll today is 2469245. That number and that website are both in your chat box right now, as well as the top of the screen that's being shared right now in Zoom. And you are able to answer this question in any way and hit enter, and we'll all be able to see the answers populate on the screen in a similar way to the chat box, but in a way that it's a little easier for us to coordinate responses. So Maryann and Gwen and I think about this a lot, both at research levels and working with communities. Help us get out of our own thoughts here and into your experiences on the ground. As you think about these policy tenets, what seems most important or compelling to you right now? Great, awesome. So I see my friend in the audience who's really being pulled in this direction of thinking about the need for youth peer services. Awesome. The need to value diversity and inclusion. I love that that comment is coupled with listening to what youth want. We're going to hear a little bit more about that later today. Great. How do we elevate family and youth voice in policy and in deciding what service that service array that Maryann talked about? Great. Yep. Paid peer supports, really important. I think the beauty of our country is there are so many informal peer supports. How can we maximize this? Great. Challenging the existing systems. Yes. So we are here for a policy conversation that is going to require us to challenge the system. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to give you just a moment or two to keep answering this poll. We so appreciate this. Great. See that you're here among 150 other folks who also care about creating policy change. I'm going to take us to the, we're going to take you to the next part of the content where we talk a little bit about how might we move forward or make change in some of these policy tenets that we have introduced. Okay, if we could go end screen sharing for the Menti poll and go back to the slides, that would be great. Thank you. All right, and as Gwen pulls those up for me again, what I'm going to walk you through is a very basic outline of how to make policy change happen. We provided several resources that will be included in the resource slides at the end of this PowerPoint deck that's available to all of you. Because this process, while I could succinctly summarize it onto one slide, takes much more work than that. So we're going to provide you very specific examples of this policy change process and more resources as sort of our gifts to your work. Thank you, Gwen. Okay, so I'm providing, yeah, Gwen, go ahead and show them all. That's fine. So this is a step-by-step process, and it's a cycle. So someday I'll be able to figure out how to do that on PowerPoint. So what we want to do first is define the issue, right? So think back to one of those policy tenets that was really important to you. So my friends in the audience who said we need formalized, available, financed youth peer support services. Our issue is a lack of services, a lack of peer-delivered supports for young people experiencing mental health challenges. Okay, we know what our problem is. Sometimes we might ask this in a form of a question or make a problem statement from which we're going to work. The next part of policy change is to find our partners. You're going to hear from some experts who have been making successful policy change. No one is going to tell you that they did it alone as a leader or as alone at an agency. We need to find our allies, those who have some experience and mentorship to share with us, those that have the influence in the communities where we want to make change. And then together with our partners, the next step is to identify a possible policy change. So if our challenge is the lack of easily accessible paid youth peer support services, the policy we may want to change is to establish a Medicaid service definition and a fair pay rate for that service within our state. That's an example of sort of a capital P policy change we might want to make. And after we've decided on that policy change, again, with our partners, we're going to engage a whole lot of other stakeholders. This is where I feel so important to engage our young people and their families in building awareness to create pressure and momentum for the policy change that we want to make. It's also during this stage where we'll often do something called assessing our readiness. Is there a readiness for the field? Are we woke and ready for this moment? If we're not, we might take a couple steps back to do some more work. You're going to hear about that in our stories today. And once that sort of momentum has been created, then the sort of true calling people who have influence and power and authority begins, the true sort of advocacy experience. Note that that is not how we start. There is often great foundational work that needs to be laid. Sometimes we're not successful. And at this point, we go back to the top and start again, or maybe we still agree that our combined identified issue is correct and we need to move back to identify another policy change we can create. If we are successful in advocating successfully for the policy change we're looking for, we begin the process of implementation. And I imagine that many of you on the phone are actually in that place already in some of these areas. And you know that in this process, evaluating the effectiveness is so important. Sometimes we get the change we were looking for and it doesn't work exactly the way we envisioned it. And so these last couple of stages, sometimes we cycle through on repeat again and again. And if any of you are successful, and I sure hope you are in completing this process, most of us as change agents in this world go right back to the top with a new problem or a new issue that we want to ascribe to. So again, such a fast overview of creating policy change, many resources for you. But what I really want to do is introduce you to some change makers who are doing this on the ground right now. Gwen, I think you're ready with intros for some other voices that are going to join us.
I am. Thank you, Johanna and Maryann. We're very privileged today to have the advantage of learning from two individuals who are part of ongoing change to benefit young adults. As you'll see here, Susan Wing and Nia Westbay are going to share their experiences. They join us now via pre-recorded video, but both are participating with us today. Thank you, Sue and Nia, and will be available during the question and answer section if you have things you want to address or talk to them about. So Allison, we can go ahead with the videos now.
Hi, I'm Susan Wing. I'm from the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, and I am here to talk to you about the Massachusetts regulation change. How did we get it done? And also, how did we decide what to change in the regulations? So I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think were really important in how we got this done. A foundation, leadership, timing, and a combination of simplicity and vision. So let me talk about foundation. We have been working on transition age young adult services for quite a long time. We started by developing champions within the system. For example, we had a transition age work group starting in 2004. We developed strong stakeholders. We developed a Commissioner's Statewide Mental Health Council subcommittee on transition age services, and that subcommittee was led by 2 young adults. That was a very strong council. We also developed Young Adult Voice. We developed a statewide Young Adult Council and a regional Young Adult Councils. And they grew to be involved in a lot of policy concerns. They did their own initiatives like creating a website. And they ended up being a very strong voice in many things. We piloted regional and statewide initiatives, and then we learned from them. So we did a lot of things it went okay, some didn't go okay, but we learned along the way, and I think that was important to our foundation. The other thing we did is we broke down barriers for things that were within our control. So we really pushed ourselves within our system to say, do we have to do it this way? How can we do it differently? And so what that did is that really helped us figure out what we could change on our own and what we couldn't change on our own. And really, we needed a bigger policy change to have an impact. And this really gave us focus for our policy development. The next thing is leadership. We had very strong leadership. We had a very strong commissioner committed to this issue, and a very strong secretariat. That is always important when you're having change, and it really made a difference in this case. And that commissioner also had a very strong backup of support. So all of the stakeholders, the young adult councils, all of the things we were doing before as part of our foundation, when the time came for the leadership to want to support this change, there was already a lot of backup that person had to help facilitate the change. Timing is really critical always. Opportunities are going to present themselves, and you need to just jump on them. So in our case, we had a regulation review process going on, and that can be a very basic process to just sort of update things. And we took the opportunity to say, why don't we just jump in and see if we can make more of a policy change here and have a significant impact. And so, those two things coming together at the same time actually worked out very well. The other thing about timing is we were ripe for change. We had done all that foundational work. We knew where we were hitting up against barriers. We knew the regulation was in our way to do kind of what we wanted to do to really serve transition age young adults well. And so we had stakeholders and research and outcome data and our own history of problem solving, and every person that was then involved in thinking about the policy change had already heard that it was an issue. This was not a new idea, and knew we were overdue for making a change, and that helps when it comes time to support a change. Simplicity and vision, I think, were really important. So the regulation change itself was just a few words, but it had a big vision behind it. And I think that was really important. We had this vision, obviously, from the lessons that we learned, from the voices that we heard in our foundational work, from the knowledge of the barriers that we knew we couldn't overcome without a regulation change. And so that all fit into the vision. And the vision was simple. I could talk about the vision for a long time, but simply came down to improving access and making services available to that are based on developmental need and not just age, to really give people what they want, what they need, and not because you're this age or that age. The simplicity in the regulation itself said, basically two things. A person would be eligible for children, youth, and family services up to the age of 22. Previously, it was 19. And secondly, anyone between 18 and 22 can access any services from the child, youth, and family system or the adult system or both. So you had access to the full menu of adult services and child, youth, and family services. That was the regulation change. But what's really important about this is that The regulation change came with a vision from leadership and all the way down that had to do with permeability, that had to do with increasing engagement, increasing access, that really was about we're making a paradigm shift. We want to change everything we do and how we do it. So we could have taken this regulation change and just sort of said, well, we're moving the bar and continue doing things the way we're doing. But what we said is that's clearly not enough. And we need to really have the change speak to the true vision that we had. And so the way that was operationalized was through implementation guidelines. And implementation guidelines was actually the big document that really spelled out how are we going to really get this permeability? How are we going to change what we do, all of the things that we do, so that we're getting to the essence of really improving access, of really getting the full menu of services to the individuals. So the implementation guidelines were hashed out using the youth voice, the stakeholders, all the lessons learned from previous, and bringing all of those people together and empowering them to say, okay, operationalize the vision, operationalize these regulation changes. And so that document, that piece went hand in hand with the regulation change and really made the difference. So a few examples of what we ended up with. Immediately, we had more people eligible for services because of the change in the diagnostic criteria. Immediately, we changed our service authorization process to be a face-to-face first and put back the paper process. Immediately, our service planning had children, youth, and family and adult people at the table, hand in hand, using each other's expertise and responding to people's needs, their developmental needs, not just because you're this age or that age. So all of that foundation ended up in the operationalizing of the regulation change. So that's what we did in Massachusetts. We're still working on it. It was a big change, but it was a good one. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nia Westbay, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst on the Youth Policy Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, in Washington, D.C. CLASP is an anti-poverty policy advocacy organization. We've been around for just over 50 years, and we do our work in 5 main policy teams. We have an education, labor, and worker justice team, which covers an array of issues from post-secondary education and youth workforce development to fair scheduling and paid family medical leave and other types of job quality issues. We have an income and work supports team that works on a lot of the public benefits like TANF, SNAP, and Medicaid. We have a child care and early education team. We have an immigration and immigrant families team. And then we have the youth team, which is where I sit. The youth team is unique at CLASP in that we're the only team that focuses on a specific population as opposed to a policy area. So we really work across an array of issues that intersect with other teams at the organization and across the lives of young people who are experiencing poverty or living in high poverty communities. One of the issues where we have been doing work is youth and young adult mental health. And I'm going to talk with you all a bit today about how we work with young people on developing policy solutions and working towards their implementation. Some of you all might be familiar with HEART's Youth Engagement Ladder. If you're not, do a quick Google, or I think it's available in the resources for this session. But the ladder really describes some of the different levels at which organizations can engage authentically with young people, as well as some of the ways that we don't want to engage young people because it's not authentic. I'm going to talk with you all a bit today about how we work with young people on 3 rungs of HEART's ladder. where young people are consulted and informed, where young people lead and initiate, and then where there's shared decision making between youth and adults. So first, consulted and informed. What does that look like? This is a situation where you're typically asking young people for their feedback and then integrating that into how the work moves forward. So when we first started working on youth and young adult mental health a couple of years ago, we kicked off that work with a series of focus groups all around the country. We talked with African American young people living in a couple of places in the Southeast United States. We talked about with a group of young people from what are called small and hard to reach communities. So that was young people in a rural community, young people experiencing homelessness, Indigenous young people living in urban areas, as well as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander young people. And we talked with these young people about what mental health means to them, what language they use to talk about it, what types of supports are helpful in their communities and which ones weren't, about what health insurance has to do with it all, and what they see as needed more in this space. And we really learned a lot from those conversations. And I'll just give one key example that I think was really transformative for how we did the work. What we really heard from young people is that the way they think about mental health is in terms of who you want to be as opposed to what you're trying to avoid. What are the strengths, skills, assets that young people want to achieve as opposed to just things that they want to avoid? And this is not the way that in a clinical sort of conversation or in many policy spaces, people are thinking and talking about mental health. But that really became a guidepost for us as we move forward and develop the rest of the work. And their thoughts and their voices impacted a couple of reports that we put out that included policy recommendations based on their feedback, one of which is called Behind the Asterisk and is available to you in your resources for this session. The next rung that I'm going to talk about is where young people lead and initiate. So this looks like young people's ideas, goals, targets are out front. And the analogy we use a lot in my team is that we think of ourselves as the adults as the gardeners, where young people have the ideas, they plant the seeds, they are the flowers, and we are helping to make sure that the flowers grow successfully. So what does that look like? For us, we offer a Policy 101 workshop to young people. Again, we've done it with a number of different groups of young people all around the country. But again, I'll share some examples from some state technical assistance work that we were doing around youth and young adult mental health in the state of Utah and the county of Prince George's in Maryland. And we wanted to help support the young people, the sort of youth leadership boards in these two places to be able to continue to advance policy agenda, even though the technical assistance was ending. And in the Policy 101 workshops, we support young people to come up with a policy advocacy agenda around an issue that's important to them. So our partners in Utah worked during our Policy 101 workshop to figure out how to move the issue of minor consent laws in Utah, as Utah is the only state in the country where young people can't and don't have to consent to their own substance abuse and mental health treatment. With the young people from Prince George's County, we worked with them to build out an agenda and strategy around making telehealth by text and app more accessible to young people in Maryland. So here we had policy issues that young people had identified as important and that they wanted to see some change on. And we really provided the tools through the Policy 101 workshop to help them to be able to move their own agenda forward. So it was initiated by young people and led by young people, and we provided the support to help them make it happen. Finally, the last rung that I want to talk to you all about is where young people and adults share decision making. And the example I'll give here is a new initiative that we've been working on at class called A New Deal for Youth. A New Deal for Youth brings together close to 40 young leaders from all around the country to work towards building out an intersectional policy change agenda. The issues that the young people decided, who we call our New Deal for Youth changemakers, that they want to move forward are economic justice, justice in safe communities, immigration justice, environmental justice, democracy and civic engagement, and healing and well-being. So these are the areas that young people identified as important across their lives, and we're now working with them during monthly meetings to first identify the issues, then to identify our policy platform, what are the things that we're asking our policymakers to do, which existing legislation we might support or where we might need new legislation at the federal level. Where do we need an education campaign or social media efforts or other types of communication strategies? And young people are centered in this federal policy advocacy effort, but adults, both from CLASP and other partner organizations, are there to help, to support, to teach, to provide tools, all to make sure that we can move this comprehensive agenda forward together. So these are just a couple of examples of some ways that we authentically engage young people around developing and moving forward new policy. And we hope that you'll think about what are some of the ways that you in your work can move forward a new policy agenda in collaboration with young people.
A really big thank you to Nia and for Sue to share their very real on-the-ground experience making changes in some of the key areas of policy tenets we talked about at the top of the presentation. We really hope that those of you in the audience resonated with the specifics that they were able to bring to light in the change that is possible in each of these areas. Just a note, we have Nia and Sue with us. So when we end our session today in Q&A, questions for all of us are appreciated. So feel free to drop those in the chat at any time. I want to just take a moment to tie a couple of things together. It was so refreshing to hear Sue talk about about the successful changes that have happened in Massachusetts that have increased the accessibility of services for young adults through the regulation change, and the example that she shared that the regulation change, while just a few words in itself, was coupled with this implementation level, this practice level support work that is such an important part of making successful policy change. And Nia, I lit up with the idea of young people in Prince George's County working to increase access to telehealth. Please let me access support via text message if that's what works for me right now. And the work of young people in Utah to elevate the importance of youth voice in care, particularly around their rights to consent. These are all things that fit so perfectly into a couple of the policy tenets that we started and might be change that some of you on the phone with us today are also trying to make. We are going to take a few minutes here as presenters to talk with each other about what we heard in Nia and Sue's stories and what we might like to especially elevate for the audience that's listening to us. And I get to start because I'm already talking, and I get to elevate my passion area, which is how important Sue and Nia expressed young people being to the change process. So I noticed particularly and with great joy that young people were not just part of the stakeholders that we needed to convene. Young people were the center, being offered leadership roles in convening at state, regional levels as well, being able to be the people who identified the problem statement for which we would then move on to create policy change. Just a quick note for those of you that are thinking about making policy change and are engaging and centering young people's voices in the work. The slide that Maryann showed about the children's system and the adult systems not always lining up is so demonstrative of the challenges young people experience. We know that young adults of transition age are most likely to seek help when they want help finding a job and their mental health stuff is getting in the way, or they want somewhere to live. It's the basics. Do we have a mental health service system that allows those to be the reasons you come in the door? And then when trust has been established, for young people to stay for the mental health supports that now they're ready to receive. right? And so by centering young people's voices in this process, we're going to be able to get to the policy solutions that make that a reality faster. Gwen, what was coming up for you as you were listening?
Well, certainly the idea of champions. And so in addition to that strong young adult voice, when you spoke about the policy change process, Johanna, your second thing was partner with others. And so, yes, we all, as we spoke about this, love that Sue and Nia highlighted that young adult partners. But also, in addition to those with lived experience, family members who have experienced all those barriers to successful outcomes. And then the broad range of system partners. And you both mentioned the idea of many of us in the children's system tend to think very small about who those partners are and have to be encouraged to think about the adult mental health system, post-secondary education, criminal justice, and then as you indicated, Johanna, everybody wants a place to live and some way to support it. So housing and employment. I think it's important to always broaden that concept of who's sitting at the table and asking the question that I love from Sue, do we have to do it this way? Another thought about partners is to consider who has decision-making capabilities. Sue was addressed this with the idea of leadership. If you can't, and you can't always get the decision makers sitting at every meeting that you're having, but the importance of figuring out what are the communication pathways to get your message, your advocacy going up the line and going down the line to other stakeholders. This takes a lot of time. And I think, Maryann, when you and I talked, when the three of us talked earlier, the idea of time spoke to you.
Yeah, very, very much so, Gwen. I think in particular for both of our speakers, for both Nia and Sue, they're describing processes that really, they're noting, and particularly for Sue, sort of the culmination after 10 to 15 years of foundational work, which is, so we're able to invite, Sue to come and talk about it at this point.
Yeah.
It would have been a very different conversation if we had spoken to her, I would say back in 2005. But what that also raises is that it's important to get started because we can't all, it may take a while and we have to have the persistence and the partnership and the support to be able to do that over time. But I think also that each of the stages that they talked about is valuable in and of itself. That while there is a goal at the end, and sometimes, I would almost say that if I could ask Sue, she would probably say that the exact goal that they ended up with, the big capital P, wasn't maybe what they were thinking about back in 2005 or 2002. But something that would be majorly transformational was, but that every step along the way was valuable in and of itself. And that's part of something that's really important in being able to persist over time, is to feeling that each stage is valuable, even if it's partly learning what didn't work. So that evaluation, we've tried this thing. We've tried this thing that is under our control right now, that we didn't need the big policy change for. And actually, you know what? We could do that in a better way the next time. Let's circle back and take another look at that. So really what struck me so much was just the element of time and having the patience, the persistence, recognizing the achievements along the way, having the partners involved along the way and maintain those conversations, being willing to evaluate and start again, maybe not from scratch, but basically using those learnings. And that a lot of this can be a small shift that can be very valuable. I know Sue may not have talked about this, but we're both in Massachusetts. And I know that part of what she has done in her own leadership role and what they've done in the Northeast is always be looking at what they had control over themselves and what opportunities there were for change there. And making, sometimes it was just a small shift. It was having case managers who were specialized for the child system or the adult system. And as a position became open, filling it with somebody who was specific for a transition age youth person. Those small changes will accumulate to these big, big system changes that can make all the difference in the world. So those were the big things that struck me, sort of little p and big P kinds of changes. And Gwen, I know that was really something that resonated for you as well, as the big P and little p.
Well, the other thing, there's that, but there's also, when I think of policy, we didn't offer a definition to people of what that is. So everyone can sort of think on that. But there are some distinctions. One thing I think of is between formal policies and informal policies. And some jurisdictions have started policy change by looking at current policies across systems. And they've found that indeed things labeled policy are indeed historic practice and are not written into basic procedure. I think Sue may have alluded to that, and Nia's group of young adults working on policy may find that. An audit of policies affecting young adults can be a beginning place. One of the HTI sites in Maine did that, got all of the partners together and how are we functioning, and what is real and what is perhaps tradition, and that can be tweaked. And then what? Go ahead.
Oh, I love that idea, Gwen, because I think it comes out to be true so often. And it also, it reminds me that our audience today is very diverse. So yes. Some of you may be staff at a mental health agency. Some of you may be sitting in county or tribal or state government. You have different definitions of policy and different levers of change, right? And they're all equally important. As you were talking about that audit of policies for young adults of transition age, Gwen, I thought of another Healthy Transitions grant in New Mexico who developed through training and co-creation with young adults, sort of an agency audit from a young person's perspective. Yeah. What does it feel like for me to call and try to make an appointment to figure out on your website if you even offer a service I'm eligible? What happens when I show up the first day? What does intake look like compared to the next time that I come back? And realizing that if we sort of walk with young people through that process, we find out that some of our traditional practices, which actually aren't even written as policy, could easily shift to create a more welcoming environment that encourages and builds that sort of ongoing engagement with young people we need for them to build resourceful lives. So I love that idea of like checking what you have to do and what you can change and doing that with young people.
And it also puts me in mind of the fact that when we're talking about partners, the need for adult allies, because certainly that's what CLASP is doing, what, you know, in capital letters, but that that helping young adults to, okay, we're giving you the access to do this type of research, call up places and see what it's like to, and I think all three of us talk about that big P policy change and little p policy change. I hadn't thought of it, Maryann, until you pointed it out, that you have to, the little p policy changes are part of the baby steps that are very critical, and you have to have. Again, an example from the Georgia Healthy Transition Initiative. Their name of their children's mental health system was the Office of Children and Families. And they changed its mission and its name to focus on services to young adults up to age 26. I'm using my hands too, Maryann. And they now renamed the Office of Children, Young Adults, and Families, and that change allowed or ensured very subtly within state policies that they could make sure that the population between 18 and 26 were being served in a positive manner.
And Gwen, you haven't said your favorite phrase yet today, and we have to say it, that practice informs policy and policy informs practice. So if you are sitting here going, I have no authority to change anything related to a policy, been there, you can change practice. And if we document that that shift in practice actually works, now we have the data to take to other people's plates and desks and say, we need to change this. A simple example, and many agencies have struggled with this, some sort of payment mechanism indicating the number of outreach attempts that can be billed for when trying to engage a person in care. That might have traditionally been successful with 3 phone calls, right? Well, when I reach out to young people to engage and ask them to invite them into something not even as complicated as treatment or mental health services, it takes way more than 3, and they're not phone calls, they're text messages. So could we practice having the flexibility to send 15 text messages in exchange of 3 phone calls? And gosh, now I'm far more successful. I've been able to document my outreach being more successful with a small practice change that might be able to be elevated to make a longer term policy change. And I always think, Gwen, as you talk about those and highlight those experiences, so helpful to know what to do next.
Yeah. And I go back, Maryann, to one of the very first slides that is the dove coming out of the cage versus the being. What we can do that has the practice of policy, and what policies are barriers to good practice. Mm-hmm. And what policies can enhance good practice.
Good practice.
Yeah.
I would suspect for probably everybody in our audience that they can imagine their own practice or their own organization or their own life in a way that bumps up against a policy that is keeping them from having that. And that's a great guide to what policy change is, even if just making a list of those and starting there and comparing it with others. That in many ways we used research to come up with the 5 policy tenets at the basic point, but it was also logic and common sense. Anybody thinking about sort of what is needed in a system, in a good system, in many ways would hit the specifics of those basic policy tenets, and being able to and to add. I mean, I love the 2 additions to those as we've experienced more groups being involved in systems. So the peer movement, which has been massive since that time period, and really the considerations of underserved and underrepresented populations. And what their needs are. And that's all come to the forefront. It's been so great. And I think it's great to meld it into policy concerns, because those are the very issues that when people think about their lives, either their work lives or their lived experiences, that we bump up against. And some of those things that could be changed without really P, it's just kind of bringing people's attention to it and saying, hey, we could actually do that. We don't really need policy change. But then when you hit against the P, small or big, like how do we go at it? Which is why I think this workshop is just so exciting to really be moving towards what can each of us do to make a policy shift or a practice shift.
Which is the perfect segue, Maryann, to what the 3 of us are going to ask you as the participants now. We assume you've been thinking about the policy change in your environment, both the opportunities and the challenges. So it's time to consider next steps. And those next steps could be what we've been referring to the baby steps, the small P's, or maybe giant leaps of I'm so excited when I hear the policy initiatives that the group at CLASP has come up with. Those are giant leaps. And so we would hope that we'd like you to encourage, and Allison, if we can go to the next mentee. Here is our first. We want you, when you're considering policy change to benefit out young adults, what's one thing you can initiate in the next month? This will be the same thing. Go to menti.com, use the code that is on your screen, and what are you considering, thinking about that maybe could be accomplished in the next month?
We have to give everyone a minute to write like their full thought out for this question, Gwen.
I
Conversation.
love the first one that has come up.
That's wonderful. Conversations with young adults, something that can be done virtually and hosted. Other thoughts that people have of something you can do. What's your next step having listened to this?
I'm thinking about that audit of policies, Gwen, that you mentioned that a community has done.
Yeah. Advocates priorities. So that's good. You know, one of the steps was, what do you want to look at? Better understanding name the barriers. It's hard you have to name them before you can, what do the young adults want? Then we have the conversation with young adults, conversations with young adults, trying outreach through text, and document. Don't you love that, Maryann?
I love that.
Have your
as
data.
a researcher, documenting,
have your data
counting.
in hand.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. We're now discuss communication pathways up, discuss with the director. Contract language can be a very effective policy change. Much better than just asking someone to be nice.
I love the suggestion for getting text-based suggestions from young people. And actually, a lot of things that we hear about is developing a campaign with youth or led by youth. And they will have great ideas about how to solicit their peers' input. So what kind of a creative campaign could there be to engage everybody, to all youth, to express what their experiences have been?
I like the explaining policy to young adults. You can't change something you don't understand. And that's a lot of what the CLASP efforts have been with their policy 101. New goals, documenting shifts in practice. Yes, what are those practices that bump up against policy barriers? Talking and reaching out, host a Zoom meeting.
Absolutely.
Yep. And
everybody's gotten really good at it.
There's more sharing data. Okay, do you want to move on to the next one? I think, Johanna, you were basically, because we're down to 15 minutes and we want you to have time for question and answer.
For sure. Thanks, Allison. Okay, so we talked about baby steps in Gwen's question. So my question for you all is, what can you do in the next 6 months? So with a little longer time horizon, with a little more leeway to make moves or to find your partner or to document some of the things you've been trying, what might you be able to initiate in the areas of policy change in the next 6 months? So a challenge to someone in the last question said, we could pull together a youth leaders group. Great. So in 6 months, what could we have accomplished with our young people? How can we move beyond one of those intro beginning steps into a bigger change over the next 6 months. I'm spinning with so many ideas myself. I can't. Oh, great.
Try another
Good.
step. That's great.
Yep.
That's great.
Yeah. With a little longer time horizon, right? Bringing all of our awarenesses up, our team's awareness up around the needs of young adults of transition age. Great. So youth groups, thanks. Thanks for my friends in the audience. We've got some synergy. Right, including youth representatives in all of our work groups, for sure. So often I'm a part of a conversation where we try so hard to figure out what will work for young people. And then someone has to say, can we ask? Can we ask young people? That's great.
This seems like a harder question too.
Yeah.
Taking it beyond the first steps. This is great.
Great, awesome. So see some, with more time, being able to move a little bit further along in the policy change cycle. So we've determined with young people the need, the policy shift we want to create. Now we can move into bringing in those stakeholders, increasing readiness. Great. Other folks interested in training, not a bad reaction, sort of a normal reaction after hearing all of this content. I need to know a little bit more. Awesome. Okay, thinking about how to leverage an internship program as a stepping stone to a more formalized youth peer training. Some of you might have participated in a Institute's live session last month where Youth Move Colorado talked about their use of an AmeriCorps program in a similar way to try to serve as a stepping stone to document effectiveness. Great.
I like taking young adults to Capitol Hill.
Yes.
I like that one. Go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Service quarter.
Coupled with some of the work Nia talked about with policy change workshops, and then really getting to talk to people with authority and influence to make change. Cool. Awesome. I think some people definitely have heard in Sue's messaging that importance of bridging that child to adult mental health system and realizing we need to bring those stakeholders together.
And I think it's time to move to question and answer. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, let's do it.
Great, thank you. You put a lot of issues on the table, and a number of areas have come up from the audience where they have some questions or would like a little bit more information. You've talked a lot about engaging youth leaders and having them be central to the conversation. How do you identify youth leaders to engage in the work? How do you prepare them, mentor them, support them in the work? And these are for anybody who would like to take the question.
I can start. I'm sorry, I was reading the great questions in the chat box as Beth was asking me a question. Yeah, so, and I hope Nia chimes in too, because the gardening metaphor is just been in my mind this whole past week after we heard your story. So I consider myself a near peer in the youth movement, having recently been in a young adult advocacy role, and I really feel I feel like driven to give away knowledge, to serve as not as a translator, but as someone who contextualizes an understanding of why the system is the way the system is, and how young people might be feeling and experiencing it, to answer that question, that why question, like why are things the way they are? I feel really called to answer that question within mentorship conversations with young people. And then just step back, because the why the system is the way it is does not mean that's how it should stay, right? So let's get our baseline figured out. And then I just like lean back and create a lot of space for young people to talk to each other. And the ideas and the very real sort of keys to making a system that actually works come up so quickly. I say that anytime I sit at a table with more than one young person, we decide to change the world before we leave the table. Nia, I'm wondering what comes up for you.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to mind in terms of what you said is we have to start as adults sometimes adjusting our mentality about what young people can handle and what young people know about and can speak to. It's on us to sort of set up the conversation in the way that, Johanna just said, to create the space. So we as the adults might need to be thoughtful about what information we need to provide up front, about how we set up the conversation, particularly in the virtual space. I and have become a student of what tools my kids' teachers are using, and then how do I bring those over into facilitating online meetings. So if you want to know anything about Kahoot or Padlet or any of these kinds of things, these are all great tools for engaging young people in conversation virtually and really in good ways. But I think we have to start with ourselves and recognizing that young people can absolutely have these conversations. They absolutely have meaningful things to say. And it's really just on us to sort of set the parameters in a way that can be allowed to happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Nia. Peer support, another area that you talked a lot about, and I think people have questions about. One was about Medicaid service definitions and payment rates and such. And I am putting a document in the chat that has some pretty detailed information about that for you to refer to. But other questions came up about whether there are training programs or certification programs and other ways to ensure that youth peer support providers have the competencies that they need. I want to put in a quick plug for a workshop that we have, I think it's in May, on certifying adult and youth peer support providers. So I think that would be a good resource for you. But I want to open it up also to our presenters to see if there are particular things that you can suggest in terms of training, certification, and such.
Yeah, so I'm happy to put in another plug for Youth Move's Technical Assistance Center, youthmovepeercenter.org, if you want resources or further consultation on that question. We see youth peer services coming together in one of two ways. One, in a really big capital P way, where a Medicaid service definition is created, and all of a sudden we need to create a training pathway that may or may not include certification to meet that and to start disseminating services. A couple of states have followed that path. And then the other way we see is that practice change that Gwen was talking about, where through sort of innovation dollars or grant dollars, an agency or a geographic region can start practicing building these youth peer services, hiring young people, working through sort of, we recommend an implementation science approach to determining how to build up that program. And that is serving very effectively to show the effectiveness of the youth peer services that then can travel upwards to higher sort of funder and service definition places. Lots of lessons learned, learning them every day. One thing, if I had one message, it's that bringing in young people and people with lived experience into our traditional service array requires an adaptive leadership shift in the way we do business, and it's a cultural shift within our work. We are totally capable of doing it, and we should be mindful and thoughtful about that process. It's not just on young people to show up and be excellent youth peers. It's on us to create an environment where they can excel at offering that support and empathy that is so needed.
I just wanted to offer a little practical thought around a lot of the peer use programs and models that have developed have come out of SAMHSA's ongoing service grants that are targeting as the focus youth of transition age with mental health needs. And so if people are considering maybe some sources that might help them support something for which they don't have support at this point and have some of the support for the infrastructure that is needed to get that launched, those grants are a great place to start from. I know Sue Wing has had experience with those grants, and Gwen and Johanna have been technical assistance gurus around how to help those be successful. And then the other source that I have often heard from folks that they have started with is just the mental health block grants, that there have been conversations at the state level to say, let's set aside some money to essentially establish this kind of a new service. So those are some practical ideas around some of the resources that can be put behind it, and then to build that around the kind of process that Johanna and Nia are describing.
Great, thank you. Susan, for you, the issue of moving vision to reality, theory to reality, I think is a big one for everybody. And you talked about that guidelines document. Is that something that participants might be able to take a look at and have access to? And do you want to comment any further on the issue of, taking things from vision theory to actually putting them into practice in reality?
Sure, I'd love to. That's my favorite. I think that we made that document available on this.
It is in the resource list.
Okay, all right, great.
Yeah, and that document is very much a practical guideline to sort of the ins and outs of what we do. And behind that document is a lot of discussion by various groups. So it represents a lot. But I think the vision part is really important to the whole thing. The policy change, being practical, like Maryann said, policy change can mean a little or a lot on the ground. It can almost pass you by after working so hard, or you can really make it something more. And the vision of what you are trying to do before you even get into the ins and outs of it is really important to communicate, and to have your leadership communicate that, and to really have the leadership at every level down in the organization sort of embrace and continue to talk about that message of, what are we really trying to get to here? And I think for us, many of the people working in the field are just so frustrated because they couldn't get the system to do what it needed to do to help the people coming to our services, and all of the families and people we are serving were super frustrated. So, to just say, we are now answering what you've been frustrated about and responding to that and allowing you an opportunity to be part of that solution, really energize people, And when you get that vision out there first, then people commit to the change, because change is hard. Even good change is hard. So getting that commitment was really important.
Great. Thank you, Susan. There is a question in the chat. We have time for maybe a 30-second answer on it before we close the workshop. But it is about a transgender person. But the idea really is meeting the needs of a broad group of youth, and how can we engage? How can we gauge a broader group of youth in our work? Nia, is that something that you can comment on?
Yeah, let me take the 30-second chance to respond. I think the really important flag here is that you have to resource this work. If you want young people who are from the most marginalized communities to be able to participate, then we have to be prepared to compensate them for their time, first of all. So in our New Deal for Youth, every young person is getting a stipend. I'm dealing with side text right now to make sure young people get paid. So they're getting paid for their expertise. If we do focus groups, at a minimum, the participants are getting a meal and they're getting a gift card, and not like $5. We usually give out $50 gift cards when we do focus groups. And if you want to talk to young parents, you have to make sure that you either have childcare or that you're okay with their children being in the conversation with us. Like, you just have to remove the barriers to young people participating and make sure that we're compensating them for their expertise, because that is what they're providing. And if you do that, then you're going to see those barriers in terms of really any community of young people participating fall away.
Thank you so much, Nia. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our outstanding presenters, Gwen, Johanna, Maryann, Nia, and Susan. Thanks for sharing your strategies and your expertise with us. Thanks also to Elaine and Wanda for your interpretation. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this segment of Training Institutes Live. If you haven't registered for one of the 2 workshops being offered at 3:30, it's not too late. The registration link is in the chat, and you can use that link to register for future workshops also. And we'd very much appreciate your taking just a couple of moments to complete an evaluation form for the workshop with the link that's also posted in the chat. We take your feedback very seriously, and it will help us to shape the upcoming workshops in the series. So again, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you after the break and on the first Thursday of every month for Training Institutes Live. Thank you.